Hi everyone. Let's move on now to the second half of this two-part video when we're going to talk about the autofocus tool and zooming in, okay? So in the last class we saw how to make the light trace by channel so it detects the distance from the camera to the object that we're trying to focus on. So in this part of the video we're going to implement the autofocus and make it work a little bit better, okay? So we'll show you the best way to follow along and produce those results. So the autofocus function. Well, we have to start here, really. We left it off with our function and the sequence we were implementing before. But when we start the zoom in event by right clicking on it, we can do this. We can either create one more pin here and in this sequence and create another sequence to make the autofocus tool, or we can do it another way. Okay, let me show you the best way forward. The key here is we don't want to have a messy workflow or the blueprints. We want to keep them organized. So what we could do is, you could place another node down here and you could bunch everything all up together. But I want to show you another way to do it, which is going to be more useful for us. And you might notice that often I'm talking about the when, the who, and the what. So when is the event. You can see that every blueprint has a when, doesn't it? So there's always an event that represents the when we want something to happen. And we use these presets here, the red ones, to do that. These are the event begin play presets. And this one comes from the input. It's also possible to create events that do something else. Let's say I want to create an event, and let's say I want to name it from the event that's going to generate a new sequence of nodes. So to do this, I can create an event, and I can right click here and type in, well, under the add event section here, you can see there's a custom event, right? So I created the same type of node, but now it's customizable. So I can rename it. And in this case, I'll do exactly that to start. I'll rename it autofocus. So here we have our autofocus event. So just to help us understand, let's recap. Let's push play. So I'm right clicking and it's activating the zoom feature. It's moving the focal length and the aperture of the camera. Okay, so now this is working already, but now we want to include our focus feature. So following the same line of reasoning, the same workflow that we used before with the timelines, we'll create a timeline to make a focus animation. So this will be really cool for us, and it will help us not get that harsh movement between out of focus and in focus. So let's create it by dragging out and typing in timeline. There we go. And we can name our timeline as well, maybe focus or distance, whichever is appropriate for you. Focus distance, I think, works. Okay, and now we want to create our floats and the curve for that smooth animation. We use the same 0.5 seconds that we're using before. So didn't mean to do that. Just get rid of that one. We use the same time of 0.5 seconds. It matches up with everything else that we're doing. Okay, there we go. So we've got 0.5 seconds, and then I'll create the curve here. So I need my keyframes. So the first one at 0.0, make sure that's correct for 0, and the last one at 0.5. And I'll add that key, put 0.5, and there we go. So which values should I be using here? Well, let's think about it. Let's take a look at our focal distance. It's 350 centimeters, isn't it, the distance? And we'll need to adapt this distance to, or get this distance to work with the object. So in theory, we should begin at 350 until it reaches the distance that we need, right? Okay, but in this case, our focus, when I zoom in, will misplace, or it'll be blurred. And it's trying to correct the blur, isn't it, to show that autofocus. So it doesn't really matter if it's a little blurred at first. If we work with 0 as our focus distance value, it'll be okay because it will go from 0 to the object distance, right? So it doesn't really make a visual difference. But in this case, we can work with 0 and 1 as our concepts. So it's a lot easier to handle it as well this way. So this is what we'll do. We'll work with 0 and then 1 as our values. We'll create the curve. Perfect. And now I'll rename this actually here to distance. Let's rename that. Call it distance as it's just a distance that's varying. There we go. Okay, so I've got a focal distance here. Cool. What should we do now? Well, now the same way we did with all these over here, we're going to move our camera. So I'll drag it in here. I'll set it up for the focal distance. So our manual focal distance here, and these is where you adjust the focal length. Okay, so I should really bring that in over here. So let's search for it. Focal distance. Oh, there we go. Let's put context on and okay. So it doesn't look like there's a parameter for that. Maybe it's because you can't find it right away. Perhaps maybe we need to go on to something different. So if you check our settings, these ones we found are straight from the camera settings, but there's no specific category, is there? But this one is within a focus setting category. So we'll have to search by focus settings. Let's try that. Just drag out and look now under focus. There we go. See, we found it. Set focus settings. That's what we need. Nice. Cool. So what do we do next? Well, I have the focus settings here. How do I use these focus setting variables? Well, let's take a look at what you need to do. So they aren't shown here, but there is a way that's similar to the break hit result that we used earlier or in the previous video. Just this one here, right? So all the categories are here in this part under focus settings. All the categories from the details panel of the camera. And we can break them up in reverse. And there's this option here, and it looks like it's this one. Make camera focus settings, which is exactly what we need. There we go. And this is the parameter that will help us to change the focal length, right? See, it looks similar to that section in our camera settings that we looked at earlier. So we've got our focal distance, and which is obviously our object distance. And what we'll do now is add the object distance, which is the variable here. We'll get that and we'll just plug it in. And we just plug it in via a multiply. Okay. So now we have our values here, which are from the camera settings. So that's all good so far. And we'll plug this into there. Cool. Right. So now when this event starts running, it's going to activate the play. Then this will make our curve variation, the smooth animation we set up in the timeline. It will get the object's distance and it will set up our manual focus settings, right? Now, this, of course, we use a custom event. It's an isolated event. So to do the reverse, we'll have to create another event. And we'll do that now, another custom event, and name it undo autofocus. Here we go, undo autofocus. Just so it's going to disable it when we link it into reverse. There we go. So that should all work in reverse. So we can call this a what should we call it? Autofocus. Just like everything else, keep a comment around them so it's all organized. But it still doesn't have anything to activate it, and it's all in place on our graph, but nothing's going to kick it off. Okay, but once we click on the mouse, it will include that event. So let me separate these a little bit and show you what I mean. Just pull those down. So we put it down here just so it's all organized. Nice. Keep everything neat. And I'll just drag these over and I'll add another pin here. And then this is a really nice detail, is that we've created and renamed it to autofocus, right? And now through this sequence, I can search call function autofocus. How awesome is that? So because of how we've named the custom event, it recognizes it. So now we can call for it. Can you see that? This is still the event node, right? The symbol is exactly the same. So it's almost like it triggers this event down here because we've called it, we've added it to the sequence. It's a more simple way of doing it. Okay, it saves space and saves us from confusing ourselves with the layout of a blueprint. We can just call it just from there. Also, if you want to make this a bit more organized, what we can do is we can reverse these and put that one at the top. Okay, so that can be the first sequence. It's a bit neater, doesn't it? Just so that the lines make sense as to where they're going and you can easily work out what's going on. No one likes tangled up wires, do they? So apply the same approach for blueprints, right? Okay, cool. So I can call the undo focus as well. Type in undo autofocus. There we go. And that'll do the reverse of what we just done. So when I start it, it's going to execute these 3 events. Okay, and just let me resize that. Nice. And of course, the opposite will be true as well. So let's push play and see what happens. Okay, so we're playing, and now you see that? So what do you notice that might need improvement? Well, clearly, it's really blurry, isn't it? So let's go back and take a look at what we can adjust so we can get it just right. Let's think about this. So it's not detecting anything at the moment, is it? The object still isn't being auto-focused on. There's no information on it because I'm far away from the object. But when I release the button, it's still blurry. It should come back to a normal state, shouldn't it? We'll talk about that later. Let's come a little bit closer then. Ah, there you can see it. So now that I've hit the object, it's detected the distance and it's focused on it, right? But then what's happening now? When I release the right mouse button, it then goes into a blurry state, right? So let's debug it and find out what's going on. So we need to go over to this section here. And what we're doing is we're reversing through this custom event. Let's check out our curve. So it's going from 0 to 1 and it's multiplying by the object hit distance. So if the object is a meter away, it will go from 0 to 1, 0 to 100. It will go from 100 to 0 in reverse as well. But at 0, the focal distance will be 0, which is almost nothing. So it's not really going to work, is it? So if that's the case, what do we need to do? Well, the principle we've been applying so far obviously isn't working in this situation. So that's why it's important that we understand how things work, because sometimes we'll see someone else's blueprint that they've put together and we might try to copy it and adapt it to our project, but we just can't do that all the time. We need to understand how things work and then apply them appropriately to our situation. It doesn't make sense, of course, just to copy and paste anyway. So let's understand what's happening so that we can solve these problems should they occur. So what do we have to do when we're doing things in reverse? Well, we have to go all the way up to 350, that distance, right? So I have to set up our focus to 350. In this case, since it's almost 0.5 in terms of the timing, 0.5 seconds, which is instant, isn't it? We don't even have a distance timeline. Now, you can make it instantaneous if you want to. Let's have a look at what we'll do here. What I'll do is I'll pull in a new camera here. Otherwise, we just make it look a bit messy, won't it? If we drag from the same camera. And we pulled our focus settings. I'll set the camera to manual, and I can just type in the distance as well, which is handy. I don't have to use a variable because it's the final value anyway. And it's as simple as that, really. So here we're going back to the standard focal length of 350. Okay, so that's a lot easier that way. The standard settings here, 350, that we used from when we weren't zooming in. Right, let's test it again. Okay, so it doesn't find anything because it's not colliding with anything at the moment. But it's coming back okay, isn't it? It's coming back into focus. Right, now let's go a bit closer. And then when we focus in, it's picking it up. There we go. So I'll zoom in here. Let's see if it will work over here. There we go. So it does, it works, but here it doesn't. If I zoom in there, you see I can zoom in, and we also have this little blinking line that we don't want, but we can turn that off later. And okay, so it didn't work there, maybe because I'm too far. There we go. So there it works. Okay, and the black background is blurred out as well. Nice. Okay. So it looks like you just have to be within the required distance for it to pick up the autofocus, right? Let's save it now. Okay. So, right, we have our focus then, our autofocus working well. Let's turn off the line trace so we don't always have that red dash showing up in our scene. We just need to come here. I set it to none. That should go away. Let's just test it. You can see that when I release the button too quickly, it adjusts the focus, doesn't it? Maybe because there's no curve in that part. So if we want to, we can create a delay, which I think might look good. Let's type in delay here. And we'll put the delay just before it executes this undo. Maybe a 0.5 second delay. Okay. And let's try that. Okay, let's walk closer. And then let's see if it can detect something. There we go. It does. Now it works really well. There's that slight delay that just makes the difference for us. You see how it doesn't interfere anymore either now? Nice. Okay. So at the moment, it's not detected, maybe because I'm too far away. But I think now we can improve the quality of the autofocus and how it's working. So how can we improve it? Now, it's also nice to try and use the effects of the person that's trying to focus, almost like you got the camera in your hand and you're trying to focus on something. So there's a little enhancement that we can make, or a little effect that we can include here that'll make it look a bit more believable in the autofocus. Okay, so let's have a look at how we can do this. So we need to animate this to get this working. So this is how we'll do it. Let's bring in, let's do it here. So because it needs to be in the aperture. So let's go back to our camera to simulate it, just so we can demonstrate what we mean, what we're trying to achieve. So let's see, what does the aperture allow us to do? Let's find it. It might be in our manual focal distance actually. Let me just get that. Okay. So you can see the background is focusing when I change this, right? So it's like the camera's trying to work out which is the correct setting to focus on what we want to focus on. And here we can adjust the focal length. So we can simulate this, and this will create a really nice effect for us when we're right clicking on the mouse to focus on our object. So we can adjust the curve, and that will make it look like the eye is trying to focus in and focus out, right? Or until it gets it right. So we're going to go for from a straight curve, and that will help us simulate it. What I can do is just adjust this, and put a delay as well in there. So we're just going to create a slightly different curve. For instance, let me just play with this a little bit. And the length is, the time is 0.5 seconds at the moment. So it's gonna zoom in and out, but kind of like stutter. Okay, so let's see what's best to do. Adjust that to 2 seconds. And over here, I'll set this to 2, which is when it reaches its goal. And why is this so far? Okay, let's adjust this a little bit better over here. Cool. Okay, and you obviously have to keep coming back and testing this to see how it's looking for you. You know, there's no way to be too specific. It's almost like just set it up how you feel and just give it a test. Now, okay, let's just, I think basically you have to have some form of variation in your curve. So you play about until you get what you think is right. It's going to come from 6, then it's going to drop down to 1.2, which is the minimum aperture. And then it's going to go back up again, right? So we're just simulating that effect of trying to get in focus. And I think that'll do, is adjust that a bit. We do want it to be a bit smooth as well, as it just comes back up. And then let's change that to 1.2, then it goes up to 2.4. And then it gets to 1.6 at the end, which is what we want. We want that to be our final value. Right, now let's test it. Let's go a bit closer. Okay, there we go. Do you see that? You see the background blurs a little bit, right? And it slightly adjusts because it's trying to focus. So that's how you would simulate that effect. Obviously, you can go a little bit more extreme, so it's a bit more obvious, and that may make it a bit more believable for you. So we did all of this on the aperture. We can also do it on the focus as well, which is where we see the effects a lot more obvious. Now, to do that, let's find the curve for the autofocus, which is here. So we've adjusted the aperture. Let's do the same on the autofocus. We need to make it a bit longer, don't we? We'll set it to 3 seconds. So it's a bit longer to have that effect. Okay, cool. Yeah, 3 seconds. We'll keep it like that. And same principle as we had before. I'll create this and also create some keys over here. Okay, 3 keys we'll use. So I'll just go ahead and do that and just follow what I'm doing. Don't worry about exact figures. And obviously, you know, your project will be different, but follow the principle and hopefully you'll see what I'm trying to do. Okay, let's put this together. So it's starting at 0. It's going to pass this distance here. And instead of 1, it's set to 1.66. So it's going to be further away. And it's then going to come back down. Okay, much lower than it's necessary. And then it will adapt to the focus. And it goes up. And it then gets in focus with the object. So let's have a look. Let's test this, see what happens. See that? Much more like a camera, right? Let's do it again. Let's zoom in. Nice. Now there is something we need to include, which is the aim on our screen, just so we can see where we're actually pointing at. Because at the moment we don't have the line trace turned on, do we? And we don't really want that on, but we want it to have like a centerpiece or a marker on screen, so we can, oh yeah, like almost like a crosshair, so the user can see where they're actually facing and pointing and what they're trying to pick up. So we'll add that on later on. It's just another object. Nice. Okay. Now, if you want to speed up the time of this little animation we simulated, of course you can do that in the timeline. But it's pretty good. So, last few details now to make this blueprint a little bit more refined. Here, if we zoom in, it's blurry, isn't it? It's not in focus because we're too far away. And this effect here, it's focusing on the object, so that's working. But when it's not focusing on anything else, it's a little bit blurry, right? Which actually doesn't really make too much sense, does it? So let's correct that. Let's create a condition for this autofocus to work a bit better. All right. This is something that's really useful for our blueprints. And this is called, well, I refer to it as the conditionals. I don't know if you remember from the first class, there is a variable that's built for us, the Boolean variable. So what's the logic here with the Boolean? Well, our autofocus is working regardless of what's happening. Okay, it just works. So when I push play, when it doesn't find the object, it's considering that the distance is the object. Okay, and that distance of 0, and it's just not finding anything. So it didn't hit an object, so it didn't find any values, so it considers it to be 0, right? So if it's 0, it's coming to our focus event and multiplying by 0. The object is 0, and everything that's multiplied by 0 is 0. Even if I'm going up the curve and multiplying everything by 0, it's considering it to be 0, and the blur seems to be quite exaggerated. So that being the case, what do we have to do? Well, one idea is to come here and create a condition for autofocus to work. We must tell it, autofocus, you should only work when you hit something, right? If you don't hit anything, then don't work. That's literally what we're saying to it. So by doing this, we're going to eliminate this effect of it not detecting anything. Okay, because at the moment, this doesn't really make sense in our scene. So let's do this together, and I'll show you how that is possible. So first, we need to add some information here. Some information or some detail about the line trace, okay? So if we go back to our line trace by channel, in the break hit results, there are several different pieces of information that we can use, okay? Now, one of them is called blocking hit. It's red, which is a Boolean color, which is great. And we know what Booleans do, right? They either true or false. So if you mouse over it, it says blocking hit Boolean. So true is if it is the case, and false is otherwise. So this can be useful for us because it's already given us some information. If I add a variable here, it will tell me if it's hit something or not, true or false. Okay, so to us, that's really helpful. And that will help the visual look as well. So let's create a variable to store this true or false information. We'll put it down here. And what should we call it? Let's call it, is it blocking? Or maybe is it hitting might be better. Let's rename that. Is it hitting? So like, is it hitting something, right? And it's a Boolean type variable. That's great, just what we want. So I can just add it here, and I'll set, because I need to set it up. So when this is true, it's going to store it as true, right? And there we go. That's it. And I'll link this to there. Okay, it's because it's going to use that. And then the distance information will come into play as well. There we go, plugged it in there. So we have this part here that we can use to help us, where it's going to store the information. So for now, we'll just store this information. And that means that we can literally tell Unreal, you will only execute the autofocus function event if and only if it's true, if it's making contact with an object. If this variable is true, great, it will work. If it's false, then don't do anything. That's exactly what we need to be telling Unreal. And to do so, there's another node I'll need to show you now, which is the flow control node. Now, we've shown you the sequence node already, which creates a fork with the flow lines, this one here. Now, the flow control node is one we'll look at, because this one helps, the sequence helps us execute everything at the same time. Now, there is a conditional node called branch, okay, which is one of our flow control nodes. And we can put this here, and you can see it's drawing almost like two outputs in its icon. Let me make some room for it, bring this over here. So what does the branch do then? Well, as one of our flow controls, it allows the flow to come into the branch. And then you probably guessed it already. It stops right here. And then it asks the question, is it true or false? i.e. the condition. And we can mark it here as well. It means if it's marked, it's true. If it's disabled, it means it's false. So then it will analyze the condition, and if it's true, it will follow with this flow. If it's false, it will follow this other flow. And there are two different functions. Now, remember when we talked about the doors? It's an example of the type of branch flow control, the doors. We create a variable that stores the information if the door is opened or if the door is closed. And when it's running, it will ask, hey, is the door open? If it is, then it will close. So let's suppose the condition is true. It's then going to execute the door closing. If it asks and the answer is false, then it will execute another function for opening the door. If it opens it, it will close, and vice versa. And this is really useful. A very good node for us to use in ArcViz scenes. These conditions will help you to sort out several blueprint errors just by adding this condition. Okay, so I highly recommend that we use it. Cool. So let's use this in our particular scenario. And you will also find that we start using it quite a lot. But before we go further, there is another flow control node. Let me show you this now. We have this function of storing the information. We can put our variable in. So I think this is our hitting one. So we'll plug that in here. So when it hits something, it will set the information to true. Okay. And if it's not true, it will be added as false, right? Okay. Before doing this, I'll show you this through the print string so you can see what's going on. If I turn off this branch node, just so we can see it in practice, it's good to see things in progress. So this is not just a theory exercise, but you can actually see it practically. Let's push play and demonstrate this. See, look, it's false at the moment. So line trace works in event tick in frames per second. So there's that slight delay, which is why we're not getting a whole list of messages on the screen. As we approach the object, let's see, now it's changing to true, isn't it? Because it is hitting the object, and therefore the focus is on. Now, that's working, great. So if it's true and I zoom in, it will create the autofocus, otherwise it won't. And this is exactly what we want, right? Let's delete this now, and we'll go and get this message connected properly. So if it's true, it will run. If it's false, then I don't have anything here. It won't do anything. Let's see then, if it's false, it will come here and it should stop. So it won't execute any function. It won't change our autofocus. Great. Let's see that in practice. You see that? So it doesn't do it anymore, right? It's blurring the aperture, and then we come back. It's much better now. That's okay. Now you can disable this if you want, but I'm sure you'll like this feature. There we go. Nice. So it works when it hits an object and stops working when it doesn't. So There we go. So we fixed that problem now, which is nice. And hopefully we've understood why the problem was occurring and how best to fix it. Cool. Now I can also add this to the aperture event as well. And it's the same variable that we could use. This is up to you though, but I'll leave it now in our case. So what do you think? Do you think it looks good? Much more realistic now, isn't it? That little feature that we've added really helps. If you want to fine tune some of the settings, so maybe the focus or the blur isn't too exaggerated, you can do. So there's lots of different things you can adjust now that you know the core principles. What I can do here as well is I can add a branch here to the aperture. Okay. And what's that going to do? Well, I'm going to add a variable here for hitting. And let's see if it works as well. So now we're not hitting anything. We zoom in. So it's not blurry anymore, right? Because it's not hitting anything. It zoomed in, it didn't do anything. And then here. So there we go. Nice. So now that we've added that branch to that part of our blueprint, it makes more sense, doesn't it? Especially if you think about how modern cameras work. The autofocus only comes into effect if there's something to hit. If there isn't, then it doesn't need to autofocus. And especially because the object may be too far away. So this really simulates what a real life camera would do. So it's much better for us. I hope you've been able to follow these couple of videos and understand how it's all put together. Now, if you haven't, don't worry, because you can go back over the videos and just double check the content we shared, make sure it matches up with what you're doing. But of course, if you have any questions, please do get in touch. So we'll leave it there for our class, implementing the autofocus on our first person. And we've also looked at the basic movements as well, haven't we? The running, the sprinting, the walking, the camera shake as well, the zoom in, the autofocus as well. And surely you would agree this really enhance the walkthrough experience in your ArcViz scene. So I hope you enjoyed it. Let's now move on to our next class.